dive into the thrilling world of the Werewolf Committee, where every howl could be a call to adventure. Subscribe now to join Alina on her elemental journey. Uncover the hidden layers of loyalty and treachery in the Werewolf Committee. Subscribe to our channel to witness Alina's rise to power and the fires of her destiny. Get ready for a supernatural soap opera filled with romance, intrigue, and the raw power of the elements. Hit subscribe and follow Alina's story as it unfolds in the Werewolf Committee. Werewolf Committee. All students report to the auditorium. I repeat, all students. The school announcement blared through the speakers as the students scrambled their way through the halls, heading towards the gymnasium which the school used as their auditorium. "Lily, come on, we have to go there now." I giggled as she made a face at me, tugging me back towards her. "No, Alina, it's a trap. They're gonna suck out our brains and steal our knowledge." Lily cried in fake worry as she hugged my arm and leaned into me. "Knowledge, that's a pretty big word for you, isn't it, Lily?" I teased as she rolled her eyes and started walking with me down the hall. "Sorry, not everyone can be a whiz at maths," she mumbled as I slapped her arm. "Hey, werewolves are supposed to get numbers. It just comes naturally." After giving me one last look, Lily and I giggled as we walked up to the main doors of the gymnasium. Just as I was going to reach out to pull the door, to our utter shock, it swung open and revealed a very angry-looking Ms. Mavel. "Oh, what a surprise, Alina and Lily. And why are you two young ladies wandering around the halls when you should be in there?" she said, gesturing towards the room that the now open double doors displayed. Her eyes were narrowed and her white messy hair was more disheveled than ever as various strands escaped her tight bun. "Ms. Mavel," Lily said, smiling widely, "you see, I seem to have the stomach bug, and Alina over here was simply helping me return from the nurse's office." Lily lied smoothly as she gave me a grateful smile and softly patted my head to add to her little act of innocence. However, Ms. Mavel wasn't believing a word Lily was saying as she stared at her with a blank look. "Werewolves don't get the stomach bug, Lily." The old woman deadpanned as she began to tap her foot onto the floor repeatedly in impatience. "What werewolf?" I asked in astonishment. "Who said anything about Lily being a werewolf? No. She's the daughter of Satan and something went wrong with her birth. You see, her mum was half-fertile, so she's not exactly a werewolf." I paused, my lips in a thin line as I looked up at Ms. Mavel, who was looking back at me with wide eyes. "So like I was saying, I've got the stomach bug," Lily finished unfazed. Ms. Mavel seemed to freeze for a second. She carefully and cautiously eyed Lily before her eyes slowly trailed back to mine. "I don't have time for this," she suddenly said. "Just get in there now," Ms. Mavel said, raising her voice. Once she spun around and her back was successfully facing us. I turned my head towards Lily and shared a smirk with her that said, "Yes, no detention." We quietly made our way inside and stood behind the mob of students who jumped up and down in excitement. It was clear everyone in here wanted to be chosen. Too bad the school would only pick one student who'd be sent to the official Werewolf Committee. Rarely anyone gets to meet or even see the high-class society of wolves. Only if you're born in a family of wealth or lucky enough to be chosen to go on a scholarship to graduate on your last year. It's like their own parliament. We all know why we are gathered here today. The principal spoke into the microphone as he fixed up his tie and cleared his throat. "The student we have chosen this year has all the qualities the Werewolf Committee is looking for. Confidence," he said, looking around as the crowd fiddled nervously with their fingers while Lily and I snickered at them. "Academic," he said, glancing down at the notes in his hands. "Athletic, who do you think it'll be?" Lily whispered as she kept her eyes glued to the principal to avoid making it obvious she was whispering to me. "I'm thinking Ashley," I said, looking at Ashley, who stood up straight as she played with her blonde hair, looking as confident as ever. Ambitious and last but not least compassionate. Once the principal finished listing this year's qualities, the crowd's buzz awoke and everyone rubbed their hands together in anticipation as they gave each other wistful looks. "And the person who will be leaving tonight as Constant High Scholarship graduate is..." He paused, looking around the crowd. His eyes suddenly found mine and he held eye contact. My eyebrows immediately raised. "Alina 𝐊𝐢𝐳𝐷. Prologue, everyone, you may leave Alina. Please stay back." I watched in amazement as everyone broke out into whispers. Various people openly stared at me, and I overheard a few wondering who I even was. Soon enough, they hurried out of the gym. Some people gave me smiles on the way, while others glared and stomped away. He said, "Harry Potter, right?" I asked Lily, who was jumping up and down while holding onto my arm. "Alina, it's you, they chose you, oh God. You're going to meet the High Wolves." She squealed as she pushed me towards where the principal and teachers stood. I stumbled forward and caught my balance before turning my head around and sending Lily a glare. However, she just gave me a huge smile and motioned for me to go forward. "Ms. 𝐊𝐢𝐧𝐰, I presume your bags will be ready for tonight," the principal suddenly said, peering in front of me. "Wait, you mean Scotty from Prank Patrol isn't gonna jump out from behind the curtains?" I said as I looked around for hidden cameras. While the principal chuckled, but I was dead serious. "No, Ms. 𝐊𝐊𝐳, you are indeed chosen. You have all the qualities the Werewolf Committee needs," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder. I looked down at the hand he placed on my shoulder and then back up at his face. I shrugged his hand off while sidestepping away from him. "But you say I'm so clumsy, sure I get good grades. But the Werewolf Committee, that's huge," I said, putting my hands up in the air to prove my point. "You'll do great with that." My principal gave me one last smile, before turning his back on me. I watched him walk away as I stood there with my hands limply down my sides. What happened there were lots of hand gestures. Lily said, grinning, as she now stood in front of me. "Well, I began." "He didn't say Harry Potter." "That's for sure," I said, grimly sure. Being chosen for a scholarship to the Werewolf Committee was great. I should be jumping in joy and celebrating. However, I didn't want to leave my current life behind. I mean, would I see Lily again? Would I just study there and then when the year's up leave? Or would I live amongst the High Wolf Society? Lily and I walked arm in arm down the empty halls to the dorm we shared. Once we entered, I took out my suitcase from underneath my single bed. "Do you think it's true?" Lily asked as she watched me pack on my bed, lying on her stomach with her elbows propped up while her head rested in her palms. "Do I think what's true?" I asked, raising an eyebrow as I glanced up at her while folding my favorite sweater. "You know," she paused, rolling her eyes, "that you get to shift whenever you want?" She asked curiously as she looked at me for an answer. Maybe I responded, shrugging my shoulders. "I mean, if so, they must have a lot." I paused, grabbing my shoes. "A lot of land." Shifting here was strictly granted. It wasn't something we do on a daily basis. The land wasn't much, and after an incident a few decades ago, it wasn't allowed as much. Someone lost themselves to their wolf and were beyond dangerous. They had to be killed. It was like an old folk tale parents would tell to discipline or scare their children. "All right, I'm done," I said, looking around to see if I missed anything. "I'm gonna tell Principal Rufus I'm ready." I tried not to give away anything. I was feeling pretty down and didn't want to leave Lily behind. But sure enough, she noticed something was wrong. "Alina, you don't look happy. What's wrong? Did 𝐿𝐻𝐼𝐴𝐻 steal your cookie again?" she asked with a disapproving tone as she shook her head. "Art, don't remind me. That kid is the devil's descendant. That cookie cost me $1, I replied sadly. "I waited a whole line to get that cookie." "Put 𝐿𝐻𝐼𝐴𝐻 aside now, what's really wrong?" she asked as she got up and stood to stand in front of me. When will I see you again? I mean, the bus trip's 3 hours away and..." I chalked out and stopped talking before a sob could make its way through. "Alina, I will see you again, I promise. They'll let you visit," she said reassuringly as she leaned in and gave me a tight hug. "All right, if you say so, I'll see you soon," I said, concealing my tears with a smile. Walking to the door, "Goodbye." I wheeled my suitcase behind me as I made my way to the principal's office. I looked up at the tall wooden doors that greeted me when I arrived. I lifted my hands up to knock but froze when I heard a voice from inside. "Yes, Adrian, she'll be there by tomorrow," said the muffled voice. "Indeed. She'll be the perfect distraction." Confused and not wanting to eavesdrop, I knocked onto the wooden door that echoed loudly. "I've got to go," and with that, the double doors swung open and Principal Rufus looked at me with a big smile. "Ms. 𝐊𝐊𝐳, what a lovely surprise. I'm guessing you're ready to leave?" he asked, looking at my packed suitcase that stood beside me. "Yes, I am. I replied, giving him a small smile in return. Well, let's get you on the train then, he said, ushering me out. I quietly trailed behind him as he led me out. We exited the building and walked out into the cool night air. There was a train stop right in front of the front gates, and just on time. The train pulled up. Here's your student pass. And here's some money. Get off the last stop and tell them your name and that I sent you. Principal Rufus informed me as he helped me load my suitcase onto the train. I pushed my dark brown hair away from my eyes that the wind blew out of my face and looked at him. I saw my reflection in his glassy eyes, and my green eyes were wide and confused. I'm going there by myself, I asked, glancing at the crowded train. Well, Elina, if we can't afford land, what makes you think we can afford private transport? He said, a little upset, while he hopped off the train after helping me. Where do I sit? I whispered, looking at all the full seats. You can sit, he said, searching for an empty seat. Right there, he said, finding a seat as he pointed towards the back. I looked at where he was pointing and felt the color drain from my face. The man sitting there was huge. I didn't want to be rude. However, he was enormous and didn't look very kind. He had numerous piercings and tattoos that made me slightly cringe. No way, are you kidding me? He'll eat me, I yelled, not caring that everyone was looking at me and getting annoyed. Goodbye, Ms. 𝐊𝐢𝐧𝐸. The doors shut and the train began to move. I slightly stumbled, and before I fell face first, grabbed onto the nearest person, standing upright once again. I quick retrieved my hand back from the woman. Taking a deep breath, I walked over to the vacant seat and stiffly sat down. Don't worry, little girl. The man next to me spoke in a low voice, and I froze. I haven't switched to cannibalism yet. I knew he was trying to scare me, and knowing that, I calmed myself down. Oh yeah, I say, not looking at him. I suggest you switch to a diet. After seeing his mouth drop open from the corner of my eye, I got comfortable and prepared myself for the long journey. Hoping I make it alive. Snow, excuse me, miss, said a voice, and something shook my shoulder, which made me jolt awake and look around for any danger. Where's the fire? I yelled, while the man who woke me up chuckled at me. There's no fire, the old man said, who looked at me with a kind smile. Then why? I say, looking at my watch. Am I being woken up at 7 in the morning? I ask, frowning as I look around the train to see it almost empty. This is the last stop, you need to hop off, he said, pointing to the display lights in the bus that clearly wrote last stop. Thanks. I grabbed my suitcase and went over to the already open doors and stepped out. However, what I didn't expect was for my feet to sink into snow. What the hell, I grumbled as I tried to walk forward. But my skinny legs won't allow it, groaning. I slumped down and sat on my suitcase as I tried to think of something to do. Looking around, I caught a street sign that read, North, the element of Werewolf Committee. And indeed were they right. The whole place was covered in wet snow. Sighing, I lifted my hand to touch the pure white snow. However, the snow from beneath my hand lifted up with it. Snatching my hand back, I looked around to see if anyone saw, while I had a look of shock on my face. What the? I whispered as I slowly lifted my hand up. 100 thoughts raced my mind, but nothing happened this time. I could have sworn it was me, but then again it could have been the wind. Or something else, right? Forgetting my crazy thoughts, I caught a figure from the corner of my eye and saw a boy with a sleigh. Hey, I yelled at him. The boy looked left and right for the source of my voice, and once he spotted me, he took cautious steps towards me. After what felt like forever, he stood in front of me. His light blonde hair was tucked in a brown beanie, while a few of the strands sticked out. He wore a large hunting jacket with long matching boots. Can I help you? He asked, his voice still cautious as he looked at me and back at my suitcase. I need to get to the Werewolf Committee. Do you know where it is? I asked, tucking my hair behind my ear as it flew widely in the wind. The Wolf Committee, he asked, and I nodded. Why do you need to go there? He asked, squinting his eyes as he looked at me suspiciously. I lifted my hands up in mock surrender as I took steps back. Down, boy. I was chosen for a scholarship and got shipped here, I said, looking down at the snow and pointing at it with my hands. I'm heading there now, he said, a little less cautious. Want a ride? He asked, pointing at his sleigh that stood a few feet away. Yes, please, I answered with a grateful smile. Sure. He was a stranger, but I wasn't going to pass up an offer like that. Plus, he was more cautious of me than I was of him. We walked over to the sledge, ever so slowly, and he sat at the front while I sat behind him with suitcase in hand. We started going downhill at a slow pace since the hill wasn't tilted down much. "Why didn't you trust me?" I asked him curiously. "Didn't? Who says I do now?" He said rudely, and I shut my mouth looking ahead. Sighing, he says, "Sorry. It's just that we've had so many other wolves attack that we don't know who to trust." He says quietly, and I nod my head in understanding even though he couldn't see. "Wait, you live there?" I ask him, and he nods. "Yeah. I go to school there and my family lives there," he says, and continues controlling the sleigh. "I didn't get your name," he says as the sleigh starts to speed up. "It's Elina." "Yours, Tom," he says simply. And just like that, the sleigh goes down in incredible speed. I yelp in surprise and clutch onto Tom's shoulders tightly while he laughs at my reaction. Once it's over, he gets of the sleigh and helps me off. The snow here is only a few centimeters high and I can walk again. I'm never doing that again. Regaining myself after that life-threatening situation, I finally had the decency to look up, and that sight that was upon me left me speechless. I was officially standing in front of the Werewolf Committee, and it wasn't just any ordinary building. No, it was huge, like a massive castle with people buzzing around. It went up very high, maybe 100 meters up into the sky, and it was made out of what looked like some sort of pavement. It had beautiful designs and foreign words written around it. "Can you say wow?" I say, my mouth gaping open like a fish. Tom looked at me weirdly and back at the building. "It's nothing fancy, kind of boring if you ask me," he says, shrugging his shoulders as he starts walking up the many stairs. "There's nothing fancy, are you crazy? Look at this place," I said, running up the stairs, past him and tilting my head up to see the endless height of the tall double doors. He just watched me with a smile as he shook his heads and opened that tall doors. We entered inside and all I saw was white, pure shiny white, exactly in contrast with the snow outside. It was beautiful. "I'll take you to one of the alphas. Come," he said, gesturing me forward. "An alpha. An actual alpha. Oh my, if only Lily was here." I gushed, but Tom wasn't paying attention to my rant as he led me through many halls. "Go on in, I'll take your things," he said, pointing to the door and walking away. I looked at his now empty spot with my mouth open wide. This is the second time today someone just dumped me somewhere with no idea of what to do. Taking a deep breath, I took small steps towards the door and balled my hand into a fist before knocking onto the door. I stood up straight as soon as I heard the voice. I started to feel nervous at the fact that ordinary girl Elina was meeting an alpha. I curled my fingers around the wooden knob and pushed the door open to reveal a man sitting behind a wooden oak desk with papers scattered on top. "Are you one of the alphas?" I asked cautiously as I slowly walked into the huge office. I quickly examined the room and was more than impressed. There were bookshelves, tons of them, that lined up every single wall. The ceiling went on forever and was made out of glass that allowed me to see the clouds moving past. "No, I am his beta. He's not here right now. Can I help you?" the man snapped, his eyes narrowing as his light brown hair covering his forehead fell down in soft curls. "I just arrived on a scholarship and—" I trailed off and scratched the back of my neck, surprised he was being so rude. Weren't they supposed to know why I was here? Who entered their territory, and most importantly, who I was? Scholarship? I thought that wasn't until December. He said, his eyebrows scrunched as he looked at me for an answer, but I just stared at him blankly. I took that moment to examine him. From the stories I've heard, alphas and betas were mean and scary, but most importantly powerful. So far I was just getting the mean vibe right then. "Just take a seat, I'll call the alpha. Don't touch anything." He growled the last part as he got up to walk out. I wasn't planning on to. I mumbled roughly as I sat on one of the black leather sofas. "Excuse me," the beta growled as he turned around to face me. I looked at him confused. Were betas meant to be like this? What was up with his temper? "You're excused," I said, giving him a weird look as I played with my fingers. In speed like lightning, I was grabbed by the neck and slammed against the nearest wall. I yelped in surprise and then gasped for air as hands tightened around my neck. "You may be new here, but around here us betas and alphas are respected." He spat, his eyes darkening while I struggled to breath. I croaked, and the beta loosened his hold a bit to hear what I had to say. Well, where I come from, men treat a lady with respect. I spat back as I kicked him in the shin. He hissed and let go of me. I was surprised it even hurt him. It wasn't easy to hurt a beta, and I didn't usually use any sort of physical strength on people. I fell to the floor when he dropped me, and he was in front of me in a second, eyes blazing as fury radiated off him. He roared in rage as he made a move to grab me. Duncan, a voice questioned, and it made me freeze. Alpha Tate, the beta said, turning around quickly and bowing his head in respect. What's a girl doing on the floor in my office? The voice, who now I knew was the Alpha, asked, and I felt something stir in me. I had an ache in me that wanted to look at him, but the beta. Duncan blocked my view. She's here on a scholarship. She was being disrespectful, and I put her in her place. Duncan said darkly as he turned around to glare at me. I slowly got up and looked at him with my eyebrows raised. That's not what the bruise on your leg says, I said smugly as Duncan took a threatening step forward. But the man Alpha Tate snaked his hand around his arm. I looked up and was met with a pair of mesmerizing hazel eyes. The smug smile on my lips vanished, and my eyes were locked with the hazel ones staring back at me. Look, you little brat. Duncan began to snarl, but Alpha Tate pushed him back. Leave Duncan. Alpha Tate growled, but his eyes never left mine, and shivers went through my body. I will, Alpha, just let me finish this one off. And are you defying me, Beta? Duncan. The Alpha said, his eyes finally leaving mine as he snapped his head towards Duncan. What? No, it's just that. He stumbled on his words as the Alpha narrowed his eyes at Duncan, making him take steps back, his head down in submission. Leave now. With that, Duncan bowed one last time before leaving the room in a rush as the door slammed behind him. I let out a shaky breath and was greeted by warmth as Alpha Tate appeared in front of me and looked at me in awe. Mate. I looked at him as well, and oxygen soon left me. His beauty was breathtaking, and I couldn't find it in me to talk. Just stare. What's your name? He breathed, his breath fanning my cheek. As I shivered in pleasure, closing my eyes as a soft left my lips, making him grab my waist and pull me to him.
Elina 𝐊𝐢𝐺𝐻,
I said once again, staring at him in shock. This Alpha was my mate, mine. His eyes darkened as I spoke, and he buried his head in my neck as he breathed in my scent. My eyes fluttering closed. The warmth suddenly vanished, and my eyes snapped open only to find him on the other side of the room, looking like he was trying to control himself. You're my mate, he mumbled to himself. But you're so young, he said, looking at me. I couldn't, he stated, turning away. Why? I'll be 18 in a week, I exclaimed, suddenly sounding desperate. What was this feeling inside of me? This emotion I felt towards him. You're not even an adult, he said, raising his voice as he ran a hand through his head. I looked at him and tried to estimate his age. I was thinking 22 at most. That wasn't much of a difference, right? You should leave, Alpha Tate suddenly said, turning around, his expression hard. I just slightly nodded and looked at the ground, feeling tears pool in my eyes. I was confused. No one ever had that effect on me. Look, I just need some time to think things through. Okay, he asked, appearing in front of me and lifting up my chin. I gave him a soft smile and nodded. He bent down and gently kissed my cheeks as a growl rumbled in his chest, so he quickly moved away. I quickly shuffled past him and led myself out, taking a deep breath, my heart beating fast. Alina, there you are, I'll show you your room. I looked up to see a smiling Tom who held my suitcase and led me to my new room. A million thoughts raced my mind, and I felt a headache and knew I had to rest, not even bothering to admire my plush room. I ran to the bed and sunk in the soft sheets. Even though it was technically morning, I was exhausted. Closing my eyes, I saw hazel ones staring back at me. Either way, sleep found me immediately accepting, waking up to the light in my eyes. I groggily sat up and groaned. I looked over to the curtains that were drew open, and my face scrunched in confusion. I didn't remember opening them. Placing my feet onto the wooden floor, I hoisted myself up and stretched my limbs as I stared out the window where little flecks of snow gently fell from the sky. Smiling slightly, I walked to the window where the light came in from, to see a yellow sticky note. Picking it up, I squinted to read the small messy writing. Your lesson for the day begins at 2 in the training field. Slowly turning my head to look at the clock, I saw that it was nearly 3. A few seconds pass, a minute, then 2. Crap. With that out of my system, I lung for my suitcase and throw it open. Knowing that someone came in my room while I was asleep made me feel uncomfortable. But I didn't have time to dwell on it. Digging through my belongings, I pull out leggings and a big jumper that has been washed way too many times. The color blue was dull as ever. Putting on my clothes, I pulled out my runners that were a little ripped and old but very comfortable and slipped them on. Once I freshened up, I headed out of my room while pulling my hair into a ponytail. I didn't have time for breakfast, and that sucked because I was getting hungry. Heading to the training field, I had no problem finding it because it was outside and that's the only place I knew how to get to. I found it awesome that here at Werewolf Committee the students only had one lesson for a whole day. And the best part is only for a couple of hours. Arriving outside, I immediately cursed at my stupidity. Forgetting that snow replaced grass here, I hadn't bothered to wear boots on. Stepping onto the snow, expecting my feet to sink in it. Didn't. I walked on the snow with ease as I made my way over to the group of people tackling each other with a partner. The scene of snow made my senses come to ease, and the watery scenery seemed to bring me comfort. A flash of the memory of yesterday where the snow moved with my hand came to my mind, and I shook my head. Hey, I'm here for the lesson. I more like asked the man who stood with his arms crossed staring ahead at the students fighting. You're late, he stated in his rough tone, not making eye contact with me. Sorry, I'm new and got lost. The building is huge. I lied smoothly as I shook my head, exaggerating the huge. The man, who I might add bald, turned to look at me. Looking me up and down, he smirked before looking back forward. You look like the type a human can even snap your bones in half, he said smugly as he didn't spare me another glance. I just raised my eyebrows in amusement. Really? You look like the type who takes too many steroids to look buff, I said, crossing my arms as well as I looked up at him with a smile. He finally acknowledged me fully as he turned to face me completely, anger evident in his eyes. What was up with people and their temper? Listen here and listen real good. You don't have the kind of authority, he said, looking around, or any to speak to me like that girl, he said, growling as a few students glanced at us in curiosity. It's Elina, big man, and I'm told that a lot. What is it with you guys and authority? I asked, more to myself. After saying that, an image of Alpha Tate popped up into my mind and I sighed, recalling my mate's beauty. I was hoping to avoid the memory of him for a little longer. My wolf, who hasn't been let out for a while now, was longing for its other half along with me, who wanted to be next to him. But that wasn't possible. He hasn't decided whether he even wants to be with me or not. Truth be told, I wasn't quite sure either. He was an alpha and I was, well, me, do you understand? Someone growled and I looked up to see Baldy scowling at me. What I asked, completely lost. Before he could explode because of my ignorance, someone entered our mother's club. Last time I checked, you didn't have any kind of authority either, the boy said to Baldy. I realized it was Tom. I hadn't seen him since the time when he dumped me in front of the Alpha's office. My mate's office, the beast inside of me reminded. Thomas, it isn't likely for you to show up to lessons. How's your brother doing? The man said with a fake smile, grinding his teeth together. The beta's fine. You want to train? Tom said, asking me the last part. I looked at him and just nodded my head. He led me behind all the other partners and we positioned ourselves in defense mode. Beta, Duncan's your brother? I asked curiously as we began to fight. You've met him? He asked with an eyebrow raised as he went to lung at me, but I sidestepped away from him. Yeah, he's not exactly the biggest ray of sunshine, I mumbled as I tripped the advancing Tom, who fell onto the snow. That's right, work with me, Snow, I thought evilly as he stood up in an instant. That's my brother for you, he said with a small smile as he waited for me to attack. Tom and I trained for a few moments longer. We tackled and attacked. I've done this many times before, never in a real fight, but it felt like second nature. You're good, Tom huffed as he and I both dusted the snow off us. Thanks, I exclaimed, flashing him a smile. Walking back towards the building, I saw all students and older people swarming around it. The place seems more alive, I said, referring to the last time we were both here and it was empty. You should see it at night, he said, smiling with a glint in his eye. When we entered the building, I said goodbye to Tom and started walking towards my room in the far west wing of the house. The place wasn't as I imagined. It was sort of normal besides the temper of people. The alphas and betas had a powerful aura, sure, but I didn't feel intimidated. I've only met one of each though, you all right? A voice said. Looking up, I was met with gray eyes. A man in his late 40s stood in front of me. "I'm great, yourself?" I asked, smiling at him. When I noticed I was blocking the doorway, surprise. I found myself standing in front of Alpha Tate's office. "I'll be just fine if I could get through the door." The man chuckled. I looked at him and back at the door. "Oh right." He looked familiar and he had a powerful aura. Was he an alpha too, you know? Most people would be shaking in their boots if they were blocking my way. He asked curiously, his slightly white hair tilting to the side along with his head. "Good thing I'm not wearing boots then," I said, smiling as the man too smiled as he chuckled. "Father," the unmistakable voice of my mate said. I closed my eyes and silently sighed in bliss. "Wait, Father." My eyes snapped open as I looked at the two. They shared the same facial features except for their eyes and hair. Once my eyes fell on Alpha Tate's, they didn't leave him. I silently admired his dark, messy hair and hazel, glowing eyes. His body was built, and I felt my body ache for his touch as I shuddered in pleasure at the thought. "Son, I was just coming to look for you," the man said warmly as he smiled at his son. My mate looked at his father and then looked at me. I couldn't read his expression, but his stare had me nervous, so I gave him a small smile. "Let's go in, shall we?" the man said, opening the door. "I'm just gonna go to my room now," I said quietly, ready to slip away. "No," Alpha Tate said a little too quickly. His voice made my insides melt and butterflies erupted in the pit of my stomach. "Please do come in, Alina. We'll talk about your visit right after my father leaves," he said in his low, seductive voice, inviting me in. We all entered and took a seat. My mate sat behind his oak desk while his father and I sat across him. The two talked about rogues and some other things as I just sat there not listening, but simply watching my mate. His image and features were being carved into my brain as I watched him carefully. "Thanks for filling me in, son. I've got to go. But don't forget, Eddie will be here tomorrow morning," my mate's father said, standing up, which made me snap back to reality. "Yes, Father, how could I forget?" my mate replied, smiling as he shook his father's hand. "It was lovely meeting you, Elina," his father said, turning to me, smiling warmly. "You too, Mr. I trailed off, call me Roger." I smiled and nodded at him while he gave one last nod to his son before leaving the room, closing the door behind him. My mate and I sat in silence for a few moments. "What brings you here?" he asked, finally breaking the silence. "I wanted to see you," I replied, looking down as I felt my cheeks heat up. When he didn't reply instantly, I looked up to see him looking at me, and my cheeks went even redder. Why does he have this effect on me, truth be told? "I've been restless since our last encounter," he said, giving me a grin as he scratched the back of his neck. "How old are you anyway?" I asked the question that's been bothering me for a while now. 22 in a few months," he stated, watching me carefully. 3 years. "That's not much. I don't see the problem," I asked, frowning. "It's just you're not an adult yet. Though you say your birthday's in a week. I'll be ready to announce you as my mate when you're legally an adult," he said, crossing his fingers together, placing them on the table. "So you accept me?" I asked with a wide smile shooting up straight. "Rejection was never a choice," he answered, returning my smile. I got up from my seat and walked around his desk. I leant down and placed a small kiss on his cheek. He wrapped his arms around me and placed me on his lap, which made me blush. "Alpha Tate," I began to speak, but his frowning cut me off. "What's wrong?" I asked, frowning myself. "Tate. Call me Tate," he stated, firmly tightening his grip on me. I just smiled and nodded. He was my mate and I was his. There was no need for formalities, and I liked that. The impossible. The next day, I surprisingly woke up early. After spending most my night with Tate, I just laid in bed staring at the ceiling with a huge goofy smile on my face. Every now and then I'd squeal and make stupid movements when I replayed the moment with him in my head. It was early in the morning and the sun hadn't came out yet. Most people would be sleeping, and I would have been one of them if my body wasn't wide awake and if my wolf wouldn't have been stirring. Sighing, I sluggishly moved to my closet. However, my body was wide awake, so the rest of the way I skipped over. Humming to myself, I got dressed in my sweatpants and a fitting tee on top. Putting on my runners, I all but ran out of the room. I headed outside and was greeted by snow that coated the grounds. Smiling, I walked out of the building and far into the snow. Behind a stone, I stripped and got ready to shift. I hadn't shifted in months and I was getting nervous. Come on, let the beast out. Shaking my shoulders, I leaped forward and transformed into my stale blue-looking wolf, and in seconds I landed on the ground with paws. A light pain lingered in my shoulders, but I ignored it as I ran through the snow. There was snow everywhere. The land was huge, and that meant I could run up to such distances without being told off. The wind hit me and my fur went wild in the breeze as I closed my eyes in bliss, enjoying it. My fur was gray, but had a bluish tint to it, not really giving it a labeled name. After running for what felt like hours, but only minutes, I went back to the large stone where I left my clothes and shifted back, quickly getting dressed. Walking back to the building, it was still pretty early and no one was around. Before I stepped out into the opening, I watched from afar as a young woman appeared holding a little boy's wrist and dragged him behind her. My curiosity got the best of me and I jogged over to them while they were walking up the flight of stairs. "Excuse me, do you need help with anything?" I asked, and the woman turned around, a scowl on her face, but gave me a bright smile when she saw me. "Oh hey, I'm just here to drop of Eddie. I'm his nanny, I guess. I take him to my place and personally teach him," she said, gazing down at him, placing a hand on his shoulder. I looked down at the little boy and immediately remembered Tate and Roger were talking about an Eddie arriving. The little boy looked around 6, but his height made him look 8. I wasn't too sure. He had light hazel eyes and dark hair. "Just like Tate, I could take him to an alpha for you," I suggested in a light tone as the boy suddenly snapped his at me and nodded his head viciously. I watched her expression darken, but her smile never faltered. I noticed her nails dig into Eddie's skin as he winced and slightly flinched away. I frowned and looked at him in worry. It was very obvious she was hurting him, and I didn't understand why. "There's no need if you could just show me the way," she trailed of, looking at the building, her tight grip on Eddie never loosening. "I'm sorry, but not just anyone could enter the building. I'll take Eddie here and you can leave," I said in a firm voice. I don't know what came over me. Power leaked from my voice and it surprised me, but I didn't let that show. I had the sense that this woman wasn't a good woman. Her eyes and posture gave her away. Eddie was suffering under her grip, and I wanted to get the poor boy away from her, even though I had no saying in this place. "But you are the alpha's mate," my wolf whispered in my mind, making a shiver go down my spine at the mention of my mate. "Look here, girl. I suggest you move or I'll do it for you." She suddenly growled. She was waiting for a reaction. "That's what they all want. And like always, I don't give it to them." "Oh really? I wonder what the alphas would think if they found out that you were being disrespectful to their guests," I said, smirking as I crossed my arms around my chest. "I don't take orders from you, girl. Move before I hurt you," she threatened, and her nails dug into Eddie's shoulder tightly, and he yelped in pain and tried to push her away. Seeing that sight made me mad. I felt my eyes shift and anger consumed me. It was very rare of me to get angry, but I had no control of my body whatsoever. In a flash, I shoved her away from Eddie and grabbed her wrist, snapping it, and she cried in pain. "You dare lay a hand on this child ever again. Your hand won't be attached to your wrist," I growled in a low tone. The woman just hissed through her teeth and glared at me as she tried to fight me off. She managed to lash out her free hand to scratch my face. I growled in anger and fury consumed me. Suddenly, the ground slightly began to shake, ever so slightly. It wasn't that noticeable, but the three of us noticed, and both the woman and poor shocked Eddie stared at me while I looked at the ground confused. "Let go of me, you freak," the woman now screamed. I threw her away from me, and the snow from beneath her suddenly sunk deep in, making her land roughly in, and she screamed loudly as numerous bones cracked from the impact. I stared shocked and looked at Eddie, whose mouth was wide open. "What is going on?" A voice boomed and every one of us froze. Tate appeared, looking as fine as ever, making his way towards us, his eyes cold as he approached us. Roger, Duncan, and Tom trailing behind him. I turned around to explain the impossible, however the woman just laid on the normal flat surface of snow unconscious. "Dad," Eddie yelled, speaking for the first time as he ran into the arms of Roger, who caught him and lifted him up. "What happened here?" Tate whispered, his breath suddenly next to my ear, and I shuddered. I trailed, still shocked, as I looked around confused. The snow, the ground, did I do that? I looked up to see Tate already looking at me, worried, as he held my arm to hold me upright as I swayed slightly. Tate examined my face, and a thunderous growl erupted from his throat, making me jump back. "Who did this?" he said in a low, dangerous voice, and I stared at him wide-eyed. Sniffing the air, his head snapped to his brother's Eddie's, and another growl escaped him. "Your shoulder," he growled, looking at the nail marks carved into his skin as little droplets of blood occurred. "Tate, it was so cool," Eddie suddenly said, a huge smile lighting his face. He ran to Tate, who picked him up and rested Eddie on his hip. "Rachel was hurting me and made me bleed," he said excitedly, then pointed at me. "And then she got really mad. She grabbed Rachel's here," he said, grabbing his own wrist to show us all. "And then she snapped it, it went crack. Rachel scratched her face, and then he stated, glancing at me, saved me. She made Rachel look so weak, it was so cool," he said, out of breath, and took a huge gulp of air. "It was crazy. She made the ground." He suddenly paused, and his eyebrows scrunched in confusion as he looked at me for a while, before giving me a small smile while I stared back with pleading eyes not to tell the crazy things we witnessed. "It was so cool," he stated instead, and I sent a mental thanks buddy. Tate, Roger, Duncan, and Tom all listened and looked at each other silently as if they were talking. "Mind link," my wolf kindly reminded me, and I did a mental "Oh. Are you all right?" Tate asked softly, placing Eddie down, who bounced in his spot. "I'm great, but you had to be there, it was so cool," Eddie said, smiling softly as he repeated "cool" for the 100th time. "It was adorable, everyone go inside. We will talk about this later, Duncan. Thomas, could you take Rachel to the cells? She will be held there for violating the Alpha's brother and the Luna," he said, expressionless. Everyone gasped at his words, and I stared at him with wide eyes. "What, she's your mate?" Duncan asked, and a look of guilt flashed past his eyes as he bowed his head and looked away. Tom looked at me with a smirk and approving nod, and I gave him a small smile.
Elina 𝐊𝐿𝐴,
"My son's savior and my other son's mate. I think that can work," he said, grinning while I let out a laugh at that. Tate dismissed them, and once everyone left, it was the two of us standing there together as silence took over. "Thank you," he suddenly said. "We all suspected something was off about Rachel, but physically hurting others, that's not acceptable." I looked away, ashamed. "I'm sorry. I didn't want to cause destruction, but when she was hurting Eddie and when she scratched me, I lost it," I said, throwing my hands in the air to prove my point. He appeared in front of me, so close our noses were almost touching. "Does it hurt?" he said, worry in his voice as concern overtook his features. I shook my head no and shyly smiled at him. "I will kill her for this," he suddenly grumbled, and my head snapped to him. "Kill," I squeaked. I didn't want to be responsible for someone's death. Tate placed his hands on both sides of my face and made me look at him. I felt tingles, and his hazel eyes stared into my green ones, making me forget our surroundings. "You did nothing wrong," he stated firmly. "I'm proud to call you my mate." And with that, his lips smashed onto mine. My arms automatically wrapped around his neck, and I tugged him closer, making him growl. Tingles shot through my body, and I closed my eyes in bliss as his arms wrapped around my body. And that, without a doubt, was the best kiss of my life. Fire hazard. Pulling away from the kiss, my fingers immediately reached up to my lips. I gasped and traced my bottom lip, looking at him in awe. He panted slightly, out of breath as his hazel orbs stared into mine. I smiled at him shyly, playing with my fingers while he gazed at my lips. I trailed off, not knowing what to say. "You have wonderful lips," he said quietly, and I felt my cheeks flush. Yeah, thanks, you too. I mean, so do you. Very nice lips," I said, mumbling like an idiot, and I quietly looked away from Tate, trying to hide my flaming cheeks. "You stupid fool." I felt the gentle caress of his fingers touch my chin and make me look up to face him. "I appreciate the compliment," he said with a slight smirk. He slowly started leaning in to steal another kiss, and I did to start leaning into him, growling. I jumped away in embarrassment. Cheeks flushed as I looked down at my stomach. A throaty laugh came from Tate, and even though the sound gave me shivers, the embarrassment I was in didn't disappear in the slightest bit. How could I have forgotten to feed my mate? He said, his eyes amused but seemed a little angry that he hadn't thought of it. You know what, I'll get myself food. I'll see you later, I shouted, running for the door, wanting to get away from him in the meantime, to save myself from any further embarrassment. All I got to see was his amused, attractive face before the door swung shut. Cheeks flushed, I hurried away from the room and scowled at myself for being stupid. I searched the building and looked for the kitchen. I walk on the shiny white tiles and finally entered a pure snow-white-looking kitchen, snatching the first thing I see, which happens to be a cheese sandwich. I bite into it and moan in delight. "You're eating my sandwich," a small voice said from the entrance of the door. I turn around and see Eddie. Seeing him reminds me of my crazy abilities, and I shake my head to clear my mind. "Sorry, kid, finders keepers," I said through a mouthful. I felt bad but was way too hungry to care. I finished eating, and Eddie was sitting on the white stool next to me, watching me with a smile. I looked at him and back at the empty plate. "I was such a rude person, oh Eddie. Was that your sandwich? I was so hungry." I scratched the back of my neck, my playful demeanor vanishing as I truly felt bad. "It's alright, I don't like cheese anyway," he said, making a funny face and sticking out his tongue. I laughed and ruffled his dark hair, which he simply smiled to. "So you're the Luna?" he suddenly said in awe as he studied me. I shrugged my shoulders, unsure, and got a little nervous. Yeah. Nervous that an 8-year-old would disapprove of you. A magic Luna. He gushed loudly this time, and my eyes went wide as I looked around to see if anyone heard. I brought my finger to my mouth, motioning for him to keep quiet. "That's so cool," he yelled, and I had to grin at that. "You find a lot of things cool, don't you, Eddie?" I said, smirking. Suddenly a stupid idea popped into my head, and knowing the history of following my stupid ideas, I jumped up from my seat. "I know what we can do to make up for eating the sandwich," I beamed, making Eddie stand up my sandwich. He mumbled, giving me a disapproving look. "You know, you're quite a smart ass for an 8-year-old," I said, admiring the little kid as we walked out of the kitchen. "Thanks," he said, puffing out his small chest. "I get that a lot," making our way outside. I walked a few meters ahead of the building and into the snow, Eddie silently trailing behind. "What are we doing out here?" he asked, kicking the snow at his feet. "We're going to experiment," I said in a low, mysterious voice. Eddie straightened up at that, his eyes glowing as he ran over next to me. "You mean?" He paused, looking around before dropping his tone into a whisper. "Your magical powers," he said, clapping his hands. I nodded, smiling. "Exactly." Both Eddie and I stood in front of a heap of snow, not sure what to do. Finally moving, I lifted my hand in an upward motion to make the snow move. However, the snow just laid there, lazy bastard. I mumbled angrily at the snow. It was making me look bad to the kid. This time I closed my eyes for a second before opening them and taking a deep breath. Slowly I motioned my hands upwards, and the pile of snow slowly raised with the motion of my palm. I squealed in delight, and the snow jerked at the sudden lack of concentration, and it hit the floor. I spun around to see Eddie looking at the snow in awe. "Did you see that?" I gushed, my eyes not believing it. "That is so cool," he said, clapping his hands. I was about to motion the snow again, but straining my hearing, I heard someone approaching and stopped Eddie's son. "There you are," Roger said, appearing in sight, his boots stomping on the snow. "Dad," Eddie said in excitement as he launched himself into his father's arms like the last time he had. Roger picked him up with ease and then looked at me, giving me a warm smile. "Luna," he said, and I rolled my eyes. "Please call me Elina." "Roger," I said. Technically, I wasn't Luna yet, and the formalities were a little too extreme. "Elina." "Sure. I've got to take Eddie here inside to explain the past events." "I hope you don't mind." "Not at all," I said with a smile. They both walked away and entered the building, while I stood there staring at the snow-white, fluffy snow. Picking up some snow in my hand, I used my palms to make a ball before throwing it at a tree, and I watched as it popped into little flags. I giggled when it left a dent in the tree suddenly. Warm arms wrapped around my waist and I was pulled into a solid chest. "Are you having fun?" Tate's breath fanned next to my ear, making me shudder. "Yeah," I said breathlessly, spinning around in his arms. "You know, you have your daily lesson in a few minutes." He said, his arms tightening around my waist, pulling me closer to his chest. "I know I've got science," I said, smiling, and then realized what he said. "Wait, a few minutes?" I asked, my eyebrows scrunched as I took a hold of Tate's wrist and looked at his watch. And sure enough, it was nearly noon. "Oh, I have to go," I said, pulling away, but Tate grabbed my arm and slammed me back into his chest, inhaling my scent. "Don't go," he whispered, his head in the crook of my neck as my back was flush against his. "I have to," I said in the same tone he used. He softly growled, and with one last inhale of my hair, he let me go. "Go now before I take you on the snow," he said, rubbing his hand across his face. I looked at him and tilted my head, confused, until I suddenly understood and my eyes grew wide. "Right, well, before we do something my health teacher wouldn't approve of, I should get going," I said, giving him a slight wave as he grunted and gave me a nod. "Oh, Mr. Ronald, that old man. He was such a great health teacher. Children don't have sex. It leads to babies, and babies then lead to teenagers like the lot of you. It's a disaster," he had yelled once, his hands throw up in the air. I started my hunt looking for the science room. I was glad Tate told his father and the others not to let it slip that I'm his mate. He wanted to do the formal ceremony and introduce me himself. Finding a room in the school part of the building that clearly wrote science lab in big bold letters, I entered and slowly took in my surroundings. People were at desks with Bunsen burners, conical flasks and tubes that held strange colored liquid. Some people poured it into one tube and it bubbled up and created a mini explosion, making them giggle. I looked around and spotted a man with big glasses who I assumed was the teacher. Walking over to him, I lightly tapped his shoulder and he turned around looking at me confused. "You're not in my class?" he asked, standing up to his full length. He was tall and lanky. "I am now. My name's Elina 𝐊𝐢𝐧𝐿. I'm new," I said with a toothy smile. "𝐊𝐢𝐧𝐿?" he questioned, and his eyes grew wide and a creepy-looking smile spread across his face. "You're finally here. Come. I'll show you what we're doing," he said, grabbing onto my arm and walking me forward. I looked at him confused but nodded my head. "You see, these tubes? We're mixing chemicals together to create a reaction." After he informed me of what to do, I nodded my head and waited for him leave. If there were two things I'm good at school, it was maths and science. I knew exactly what formulas to mix to create exactly what I wanted. I mixed the colorful tubes together after putting on safety glasses. I was having a blast until someone bumped into me hard from behind, tripping forward. I accidentally knocked over the various tubes that fell around the Bunsen burner. Everything happened so quickly. One moment everything was fine, and the next people were running around screaming. On my chosen desk, a huge flame erupted and the whole desk was burning. I took a steps back and watched in shock as it spread so quietly. Impossible. Those chemicals could never create such fire hazard. I knew that for a fact. I looked around and everyone was yelling and shouting, as the teacher looked calm as ever, simply telling them to get out. They all exited the door that was left open. I ran for the door as the flames overtook nearly half the classroom and thick black smoke spread across the room. I coughed violently and made my way out but stopped. I had to get rid of the fire. It was my mistake. I walked back into the classroom, carefully avoiding the flickers of the flames. I spotted a bucket with soil in it, and using my strength, emptied it to the floor and ran over to the taps, filling it up with water. Throwing the water onto the fire, nothing happened. The fire hungrily ate up the water and the roof started to crumble down. "Fire is no match for you," my wolf whispered in my mind. Just think, just think." I repeated, and a crazy idea hit me. I had nothing to lose and went through with my idea like always. Turning the tap on full blast, I raised my palms and faced it to the water. Concentrating deeply, I slowly moved my hand and quickly lashed out to the fire. The water hit the fire and it sizzled, dimming down a little. Satisfied, but not fully done yet, I faced the tap again and focused my mind. I imagined the water coming in a great amount and washing away the flames. I coughed again as the smoke entered my lungs and knew I had to do this quickly. This time, bringing up both my palms, I motioned the water up. The pipe in the sink popped, and suddenly a huge amount of water floated in the air at the mercy of my control. Motioning towards the fire. It hit it, and I covered my eyes as it sizzled and the fire roared in defeat before all that was left was half a crumbled roof and burnt black furniture as smoke coated the air. Wheezing for breath, I ran out of the room and fell to the ground. Taking a deep breath, I stood up and frantically searched for Tate's office, but stopped when I heard a voice. Yes, the fire's still going. The muffled voice said on the other side of the door. Soon, a quarter of the building should be burnt and we can continue. That's right, Adrian, phase 1 complete. I gasped in shock and jumped away from the door. That fire was made deliberately. I heard the footsteps coming closer to the door, and I ran to hide behind the nearest corner. I had to suppress a gasp as the science teacher walked out. His phone clutched in his hand, his face smug. He walked down the hall and stopped when he saw the science lab fire free and black smoke coming from the door. I watched as his fists clenched in anger, his hands tightening around the phone. Impossible. He whispered and slowly but surely walked back to his office and slammed his door shut. I watched with wide eyes, and then quickly got out of there, coughing and making my way to Tate's office. But the question that didn't leave my mind was, who was Adrian? Ironic. Running through the empty halls, I breathed heavily as I desperately made my way to Tate's office. Once his wooden oak doors came into view, I sighed in relief and ran a little faster, not bothering to knock as I barged in. Tate. I froze and blushed as a man sat across Tate. The both of them wore serious faces. The two men stopped what they were talking about and both their heads snapped in my direction. Alina, Tate asked, standing up in his seat as he looked at me in concern. Who's this Tate? The man across him asked, giving me a warm smile. I gave him a shy smile and looked down, my hair covering my face as it played as my protective layer. This is my mate Alina, he said, looking at me in concern. Luna. It's great to meet you, the man said, looking ecstatic, and I nodded my head in acknowledgement. Blushing in the process, Tate, I said, clearing my throat. I really need to speak to you, I said, giving him a look praying he'd understand it was urgent. Right, well, Simon, if there's anything else you find out about this, I want you to come and find me right away, Tate said, not taking his eyes off me as the man. Simon made his way out. What is it? Tate asked, appearing in front of me. He brought his hands up to my lips and soothed them out since I was frowning. The science building, it was on fire. I said, the first thing that came to my mind. I heard. Thomas' mind linked me when he heard it from a student. The fire was put out and now everything's under control. What's the problem? He asked, stepping closer to me, and he grabbed a piece of my hair, tucking it behind my ear. Yeah, 'cause I put it out. And you what? Tate asked, gripping my arms, his face hard. You were in there, he said in a low growl as his eyes turned a shade darker. Gulping, I brought my hand to his cheek, caressing it to calm him down. I'm fine. But you have to listen, I said, groaning as he wasn't listening. Did you get hurt? Why wasn't there anyone else to put it out? He said, his chest rumbling, and my patience was running low. Grabbing his arm, I pulled him along with me, around the desk, and I pushed him into the leather seat. Glaring at him, even though his gaze made me shudder, Tate sat down silently, looking at me with an eyebrow raised. I crossed my arms and stood in front of, trying to keep up my hard expression. You better be listening, I warned, pointing a finger at him, and he smirked, also crossing his arms. Leaning back in his seat, the fire. It wasn't an accident, it was all planned. I mean, from what I heard, someone's trying to destroy the place, or I don't know, something's very wrong, I said, starting to pace back and forth. Tate stood up almost immediately, and he looked very angry. Who did you hear it from? Tell me, he said, his jaw clenched and his eyes darkened. The science teacher. He was on the phone with someone named Adrian, I said, watching him as he ran his fingers through his hair. Wait a minute, I thought carefully. Adrian. Rufus was talking to an Adrian. Shaking my head, I dismissed that thought. He couldn't possibly be involved in this. Simon, one of my best warriors, came to inform me about rogues circling the borders, he said, deep in thought. There could be a high chance someone's planning on an attack," he said in frustration and stayed silent for a moment. The doors behind me swung open and I turned around to see Duncan. "Tom and Roger coming in. What is it, son?" Roger asked, throwing me a smile which I gladly returned. "We have some discussing to do," Tate said firmly, sparing me one last glance as he sat in his seat. Duncan along with Roger sat in front of him. Tom stood silently next to me beside the door. "Do you think someone's planning an attack?" I asked in a whisper, my eyes not leaving Tate. "Honestly, yeah," Tom said, frowning. "All these mini attacks, they're bound to add up to something," he stated as he leaned on the door frame, arms crossed. "What would you like us to do, Alpha?" Duncan, Tom's brother, asked Tate. "There's not much we can do. Get more guards on duty. I want a guard on every second meter around the whole perimeter," Tate said, and the whole lot of us looked at him in shock. "Every second meter," Duncan chalked out. "Yes, Beta. Every second meter. I'd like them out there as soon as possible," Tate stated and leaned back in his chair sighing. His hazel eyes fell on mine and he gave me a weak smile which I returned. "If you want guards that close together, to circle the whole border, you're going to need a couple of hundreds," I said, leaning onto the door behind me. "A couple of hundreds, you say?" Duncan asked, glancing at me, and I had the urge to stick my tongue out at him. "Remembering our last encounter, that can be arranged," Roger said, and Tate nodded. After they discussed a few other things, we walked out of the office and parted ways. Tate, however, remained behind with his father, and they discussed further matters. Exhausted, I went to my room and had a long shower. The urge to jump in my bed and sleep was strong, but my stomach was hungry. And when my stomach told me it was hungry, it never stuttered. Walking to the pearly white kitchen, I had made a discovery. I was on the empty side of the building, meaning where the Alphas, Betas, and other royals stayed. Someone wants to keep a close eye on me, I thought grimly as I walked into the pearly white kitchen. I saw Eddie sitting on the same stool he sat on with me the last time we were together, and I smiled. However, it slightly dimmed in curiosity as I saw a man sitting beside him. "Elina!" Eddie yelped as he caught sight of me from the corner of his eye. He hopped off his stool and ran to me, his skinny arms wrapping around my torso. "Hey, buddy," I whispered as I knelt down to give him a proper hug. "You must be the famous Luna," the man said, giving me a sideways glance. "Famous?" I said, tilting my head as I walked further into the kitchen, grabbing an apple off the fruit bowl. "You're talked about quite a lot around the community," he said, amused, drinking his yellow-looking liquid. "This is my uncle," Eddie whispered, pointing at the man who seemed to be in his early 30s. "Well, it's nice to meet you," I said, awkwardly nodding my head. "Colin," he said, simply sipping his drink, which smelled awfully like alcohol. "Elina," I said, returning the gesture, but Colin just smirked. "Oh, I know," he said, shaking his head, amused. Silence followed with that, and all that could be heard was the awkward munching of my apple, which I so desperately tried to tune down. "Did you hear?" Colin suddenly said. "Hear what?" I asked, glancing over at him as he held an amused look, finishing his drink. "The science teacher. The one you claim had something to do with the fire," he said with a grin. "He can't be found anywhere," he said, bringing his cup to his mouth and tilting his head back. Realizing nothing's in there, he turned it upside down, frowning. Eddie snorted and then giggled at his uncle. "He can't be found anywhere," I said, shocked. "What do you mean, where is he?" I asked, frowning. "Had he ran away? Perhaps he left. Went on a vacation even." Colin beamed. "Or he ran away. Looks like it. He just packed up and left right after the fire. Ironic, isn't it?" he said with a chuckle. "Ironic," I mumbled. "Ironic indeed," I said, walking out of the kitchen. "Where are you going off to?" "The fun was only beginning," Colin said, leaning back in his stool, giving me a wide smile. "Away from you. Perhaps I'll consider befriending you once I've met you." "Sober?" I said, rolling my eyes, not turning back. "Sober? You'll be waiting a long time." I heard the distant voice as I made my way to my room. Once I got there, I went to my bed and ducked under the plush covers, sighing. After tossing and turning, sleep finally invaded my senses. I talked with Tom as we did our stretches while Mr. Baldy stood with his sunglasses on, staring at us. He hadn't really taken a liking towards me since our last encounter, where he was put into his place by Tom. Training lesson had become one of my favorite lessons because it meant I'd have someone to talk with Tom. Alpha's getting really worked up, Tom said, shaking his head, frowning as he sat on the white snow to stretch his legs. I don't blame him, I said sadly, also joining Tom on the floor as I sighed, closing my eyes, tilting my head back. This mysterious Adrian needs to stop hiding behind others and show his face. I huffed, opening my eyes once more while crossing my arms. Tom glanced over at me and smiled. Don't you worry, Elina. He'll have to show his face around soon, he said reassuringly. Everyone's been unhappy since the fire, and the warriors have been spread out all along the borderline. Everyone's pretty convinced someone's bound to attack soon. Yeah, and when he does show his face and when I'm done with him, I said, smirking evilly as I cracked my knuckles. You wouldn't no longer call it a face. Tom chuckled at my statement and shook his head, once again staring at the snow. I never would have thought the 𝐊𝐲𝐬 better yet. The Werewolf Committee would be ready for an attack. Who in their right mind would attack the 𝐊𝐲𝐬𝐬? To me it sounded like a suicide mission. We sat there for a little while longer in a comfortable silence. The mystery about Adrian and the fire spread like a swarm of bees, and it was what everyone talked about. Some people were worried and concerned for their safety, while others were confident as ever. I mean, come on. Average wolves against the 𝐊𝐿𝐲𝐬𝐬. It was crazy. Can you hear that? Tom said, suddenly grinning with an amused look. Hear what? I asked, listening carefully but not hearing anything. Listen closer, he said in a whisper, bringing his finger up to his mouth. Closing my mouth and pressing my lips together, I strained my hearing further, and that's when I heard it. Howls of war. I jumped on my feet and started running towards the sound. I heard Tom's footsteps closely behind me, and we both ran. Hearing more footsteps behind me, I slightly turned my head to see the warrior wolves right behind us. They must have heard the howls too. As we went closer to the noise, the snow from beneath our feet became less and less, and we were finally on grass. And that's when we stopped. What the? Tom mumbled, looking around. I've called the Alpha. One of the warrior wolves said, to no one in particular, and when no one replied, I turned my head around to give him a small smile. We all stood there waiting for anything. Everyone strained their ears and nothing was heard. Nada. Just as we were about to leave, a brown wolf leaped from the nearest corner and pounced on one of the men. I gasped as other brown wolves appeared from nowhere and attacked the men. However, the warrior wolves had no trouble in fending them off and snapping their necks, which made me look away. After a few more snaps, the wolves stopped to see what the new rustling of trees were. Stop killing my men. A man appeared in front of the small crowd, glaring at us. His hands balled into fists. Before I could step up to the plate and deliver a nice punch to this man's face, I was bet to it by a new presence that had tingles shooting up my spine. Tell them to stop attacking and I'll have my men retreat, said a new voice, and I turned to see Tate. His sudden appearance making me shudder in delight as I silently watched him. Tell them to stop attacking. No can do. I've been sent here to give you guys a little preview of what's to come, the man said with a smile as a few more brown wolves poured from the trees. Tate growled in anger and motioned his warrior wolves forward. They shifted in the air, transforming into their silver wolves, lunging for the brown ones. Tom grabbed a hold of my arm and pushed me away from the scene. What if they need help? I said, panicking as I tried to push away from Tom. But his grip was like iron. Will handle it. Just stay here, he said firmly, pushing me backwards and running off to shift and help the others. I watched from behind a tree, biting my nails. I anxiously kept an eye out on Tate and was relieved to see he was fending off the enemy just fine. More of the warriors arrived and the brown wolves were outnumbered. Where's your brother? Tate asked Tom in a growl as he snapped a wolf's neck, staying in his human form. As if in on cue, the beta arrived looking flush. Alpha, there's a few more wolves around the border. Would you like me to take care of it? Duncan asked, looking worried as he waited for Tate to reply. Yes, go, we'll be fine here. The warrior wolves along with Tate and Tom successfully snapped all of the brown wolves' necks and now stood the same man from before. With a grin, I'm impressed, he said, clapping his hands. If I were you, I'd leave. You are outnumbered, leave now. Tate growled, his eyes shifting black while his body shook in anger. But am I? The man said in amusement, tilting his head to the side. In less than a second his humor disappeared and the man stood there with a hard expression. The warrior wolves started circling around him, but the man suddenly raised his hand and in a quick movement motioned it towards the ground. In seconds the ground exploded into flames and fire appeared. The fire circled around him, keeping the wolves away from him. I gasped, my hands clasping over my mouth in shock. The wolves backed off and Tate looked pissed, as he clenched his jaw, stepping forward. "What's wrong, Alpha Cat? Got your tongue?" the man said in a tone of mock, as he clicked his tongue onto the roof of his mouth. "'Tis an elemental." Tom set his eyes wide as the man grinned in return, growling loudly. Tate advanced forward and tried to walk through the flames but hissed and stepped back, rubbing his arm. I gasped once more and ran towards him. I reached him and I snatched his arm. "Tate, are you crazy? You don't just walk through fire. You aren't Jesus." I hissed as I looked at his arm, which was angry and red. "Alina, what are you doing here? It's dangerous." He growled, his arm already healing, as he stepped in front of me. Hiding me from view. "Colin, take her to the building," Tate ordered, and Colin appeared beside me, pushing me away. "No," I cried, scratching at his arm. "Alina, it's not safe. I can't have anything happening to you, please." He set his eyes, holding concern, as the warrior wolves around him tried to extinguish the fire. Before I could complain any further, strong arms pulled me away from the scene and dragged me away. "Wait, Colin, I can help them," I said, my eyes eyeing the river nearby. "How could you possibly help them? 'Tis an elemental, Alina. We need to get you to safety," he said in all seriousness, no traces of amusement like I've seen him before. "Was that Adrian?" I asked in a whisper, following him, not finding it in him to tell him I could do what the man could. Except with water and snow, no. One of his many minions. He has an elemental on his side. The next time he strikes with Adrian, that's when we should be worried, Colin said with a clenched jaw. My eyes watered up, wanting the safety for my mate. I had to help the next time the man they called an elemental struck with Adrian. However, I was convinced we would strike twice as harder. The new question that circled my mind was I too an elemental?